The 3:30 p.m. meeting of the Bakersfield City Council is now in session.
.30 regular City Council meeting of June 26, 2024. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Mayor Go.
Here.
Vice Mayor Gonzalez.
Here.
Councilmember Arias.
Here.
Councilmember Weir. Councilmember Smith.
I'm here.
Councilmember Freeman. Councilmember Gray. And Councilmember Kaur.
Here. Thank you. In keeping with the Council's new resolution, public statements are now received at different times depending on the item. I will call on the City Clerk to call for public statements at the appropriate time, so please listen carefully for the correct time to speak. If you wish to make a public statement, please fill out a public speaker card and place it in the tray on the counter next to the speaker podium. We ask that you mark whether you're here to speak on an item listed on today's agenda or on a matter not on the agenda. Speakers who do not identify a specific agenda item will be presumed speakers for the non-agenda public statements. If you're here to speak on an item not listed on the meeting agenda, you will be called first to speak. Statements are given a 2-minute time limit per speaker, 20 minutes total for all non-agenda items. Public statements. If you're here to speak on an item listed on the agenda, I will call for you at the appropriate time, so please listen carefully. If public statements become disruptive and I have to clear the chambers to regain order of the meeting, you will be called in one at a time to provide your public statement when your item is called. Everyone in attendance is expected to adhere to the rules of decorum established by resolution of the City Council. Failure to abide by the city's rules of decorum, including any disruptive behavior that interferes with our ability to have an orderly and efficient meeting, prevents the City Council from conducting the business of the city. Consider this a first warning to everyone in attendance that conduct that disrupts this meeting may result in expulsion and/or the chambers being cleared. Behavior that disrupts the meeting includes repetitive statements, shouting, interrupting staff or presenters during the meeting, speaking out of turn, outbursts from the audience, or surpassing the 2-minute time limit. Madam Clerk, for the record, Councilmember Gray entered at 3:37. Madam Clerk, do we have any public speakers regarding items not listed on the agenda?
Mayor Go, we've received 2 public speaker cards for items not listed on tonight's agenda. The first public speaker is Ernie Lopez.
I wanted to
Welcome.
bring up
Please introduce yourself.
Ernie Lopez. I wanted to bring up people who buy real estate because I could have ended up hurt because someone aimed a weapon. I got the police report and everything, but I don't see it safe for people who do real estate to for them to not be ordinance where some people can get shot. I was watching a property and I almost was shot because the owner had somebody else watching it, and the dude aimed an unmarked weapon. It didn't have a serial number on it, and they were drinking and doing drugs, and I was instructed to watch that property. And I don't feel that justice was served on that situation. I had the police report. Everything was made accordingly, but I feel that that it should be more safer.
Anything else, sir?
No, that's it.
Thank you. I'm so sorry that you were shot. And Mr. Clegg, is there somebody who could be assigned maybe just to follow up with him?
We can take care of that, Mayor.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Michael Turnipseed.
Welcome.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, I'm Michael Turnipseed. I represent the Kern County Taxpayers Association. I have some handouts for you here because I know I can't get it all in 2 minutes. I attended Monday's Budget and Finance Committee meeting with the topic, the Economic Strategic Plan. The plan supposedly aligns council goals and reflects the most promising opportunities and most pressing to address the most pressing challenges facing the Bakersfield economy. Council's goals, I've been watching the process for many years. You adopt goals, they're there. Never really do we go through that whole process. Very rarely do we ever see actually benchmarks and outcomes and make sure these outcomes ever occur, because the outcomes happen 4 or 5 years down the line. The council needs to adopt Sustainable Economic Development Assessments, SEDAs. An SEDA defines community well-being based on 10 factors grouped into 3 categories. The economics, which is income, economic stability, and employment. Investment, and, excuse me, I saw the clock. Investments include education, healthcare, and infrastructure, which reflect the outcomes of the local government goals and programs. It needs to be sustainable, the environment, equality of a strong civil society, and sound government. Using indicators from publicly available sources, CEDAs assess government performance on each dimension. CEDAs were developed by the Boston Consulting Group. The city needs to get this right, and they need to adopt different ways of evaluating where they want to go down the road, because failure really is not an option. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Turnipseed. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Turnipseed, thank you so much for your comments, and thank you for being at the Budget and Finance meeting on Monday.
I was the only one.
You were, and I appreciate it. And so I think from what I'm hearing from you is we really need to look at key indicators related to outcomes. Is that, when you boil it down, what you're asking for the city?
Well, I think there's a bigger picture than just economic development and jobs. And that's why I put the handouts together. If you look at what CEDA does and go back about 6 or 7 pages, you will see a graph, actually a circle pie chart, that kind of explains what CEDA is and the different parts of it, and how we need to take a holistic approach, because it's everything that we do. And I know we spend a lot of money now on different things, but economic development is going to be the engine that's going to pay for everything and get the benefits that we need. To get better health care in the community, better health in the community, we need to do things. Education, infrastructure, our infrastructure has obvious challenges, and it's all going to come from the monies from economic development. And you measure economics from income, economic stability, and employment, but there's more. There's the equality portion. There's the civil society, which is really the public safety aspect of it. It's the environment within the city. There are many components that I don't see in your economic plan. And the Boston Medical Group developed this 10 years ago, and to address and rate every country in the world. But if you look at our economy isn't just one economy. It's based up of the 1,800 counties that are put together for our national economy. So we're part of that. So we need to look at, on a local level, a little bit different approach to what we're doing, because I think both the city and the county have big challenges moving ahead and competing with everybody else. I think we're behind the wheel and we have to catch up. And it's going to take some bright ideas and different approaches to get there.
No, I appreciate that. I read a while back, it's no longer a competition among nations, it really is a competition among regions globally. And so as we look at economic development, we ought to think about that competition. And one of the things I really appreciate about this is that these 10 dimensions really are holistic in nature. So you got, just for the benefit of the public, the economic dimensions, which are governance, environment, income, economic stability, employment. We have the investments dimension, health, education, infrastructure, sustainability, equality, civil society. I suppose governance and environment are under that sustainability, but it really gives us a 360 view on our region as a more holistic way to measure our growth in terms of economic development.
The quality of life is what it really says. It doesn't matter how big your economy is if you don't have the quality of life.
Okay.
And that includes how long you live and everything else. And in Pittsburgh's Smart City campaign they ran a few years ago, they said, if it's not good for everyone, it's not good for anyone. And I think when we look at some of the decisions we make, we need to think that way.
I appreciate it. I think two things were really striking from this for me. Number one is we have a lot of activities that are outlined in the economic development strategy. Not all of those activities are a responsibility of the city, but certainly we have a lot of things going on. We want to make sure that we are being impactful and that we're able to measure those things. That's something that Councilmember Arias and I spoke about at the committee meeting on Monday. So identifying those key measurements, I think, is really critical. So I'm going to ask Mr. Clegg if we can get with Mr. Turnipseed and discuss these ideas and see how this might work within our framework to measure the impact of all of our activities related to economic development. And then secondarily, I think the other piece is that economic development and really quality of life doesn't just sit within our economic and community development department. It really is cross departments, every single department within the city, and all of our partners in the county and education are also required to participate to improve the quality of life for our region. And so I think we all have various different roles to play. So that's what's striking when we take a look at this this framework. So thank you.
Mary Barlow made a comment, and I wish I'd wrote it down so I could read it properly, about when we have such large-scale problems, one entity, one agency cannot solve those alone. It's bringing, and that was part of her, when she started the Kern Pledge, you've got to bring everybody to the table, the education community, the healthcare community. If we're going to make the quality of life better, it takes, like what did Hillary say? It takes a community to raise a child. Well, it takes everybody to raise a community.
Thank you, Mr. Turnipseed.
Thank you.
Madam Clerk, next item, please.
Reports item 3A, presentation on neighborhood stabilization and prevention programs.
Thank you. And for those of you who are wanting to make public comment, I'll give you an opportunity after the staff's presentation. Mr. Clegg.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I'm going to kick us off, and then I'll turn over some more of the details to Ms. Byers. And then we're coordinating this presentation to include information on several different topics that we've also invited folks from the Greater Bakersfield Legal Assistance to present a little bit on one of the programs that's going to be highlighted in this broader framework. So what we're going to do today is, this is in response to a couple of different things. One, just general interest in this topic, in particular the topic of our eviction prevention program, as well as the recent referral from Councilmember Arias to really look at funding sources towards programs like the eviction protection program, as well as other housing prevention programs. So the slide that you see before you, we've really labeled this in a broader perspective more about neighborhood stabilization and prevention programs, because there are a number of different programs that can actually have important impacts on community, and we wanted to kind of zoom out first and look at the bigger picture, and then orient us to zooming back into where we're going to focus some more of our conversation. And so I just wanted to reflect for a moment that around any type of a housing response system, especially when you're looking around homelessness, this is just one example. I'm going to show you several different examples that you can look at a broader framework. And so in any good system, you need to be looking at your emergency sheltering, your transitional housing, your permanent housing, but you also need homeless services on one end and you need preventative services on the other end to try and keep individuals from entering into the need for those services and addressing vulnerability factors and risk factors. This is just another example from another community. This is not the precise rubric here in Kern County, but just another example of where you need to have an iterative process where you're addressing outreach, coordinated entry, prevention, emergency sheltering, rapid rehousing, and ultimately permanent supportive housing. I would argue that in addition to that, we should be thinking about market rate housing. And so if you look at a full housing continuum, this is just another example used in a different city. They had a fantastic graphic, so I stole it, which demonstrates that, you know, on the full spectrum from homelessness all the way to market rate and in potentially even home ownership, that there's multiple different steps or segments of this housing continuum or housing spectrum. And that often we don't necessarily move folks immediately from one to the other. Often it's we try to step individuals through some of our emergency needs into transitional housing and ultimately permanent supportive housing. But sometimes it's also about taking folks from supportive housing into market rate housing or market rate rental into market rate ownership. I would also just reflect really quickly that there's even a bigger picture specific to housing, that there's also a full spectrum of even market rate housing. And you can go from your detached single family homes to many types of more multifamily but lower density to higher density, all the way up to mid-rise or even high-rise, higher density housing. And lastly, this is just also a quick perspective, and this actually is from right here in Kern County. This is an example of how we address individuals coming through our coordinated entry system, that there are multiple steps and considerations that we need to have programs, you know, in a safety net helping individuals across multiple different need areas. And so all of that is to say there's a big picture, but we're not trying to talk about all of this today. We're not trying to focus on addressing all challenges around homelessness. We're going to be narrowing in on these stabilization programs, but we're reflecting to the council that we know that we need to address issues across a full spectrum. We're going to really zoom into the prevention type programs and stabilization type programs. Around housing and homelessness, we took a quick look just in this last week. The Kern County Homeless Strategic Action Plan has 3 different goals, and there are 27 different objectives. But amongst those, one goal is focused specifically on reducing inflow, and there are 8 of those strategies or objectives that are specific to prevention programs. There's also the city's affordable housing strategy that has 4 overarching strategies with 21 actions. There's not one of those strategies that is uniquely specific to prevention, but there are probably 3 or 4 of those specific actions that touch around prevention. However, I would recognize that while most of our affordable housing strategy is about unit production and producing more and more units, we probably can do more about some of our prevention strategies, but those are, again, recognized a lot more in our homeless strategic action plan. And then lastly, if we look at our draft housing element and many of the components that are required in the 6th cycle of the housing element, we have 5 overarching goals. There are 28 total strategies in their draft housing element. And one of those 5 goals is entirely focused on prevention and preserving housing and different prevention strategies. And there are multiple of the 28 strategies across more than one goal that do address suggestions or policy ideas that are related to prevention. I think I would note really quickly, since I mentioned the housing element work, that's largely policy-related work. It's not program-related work, but as we adopt some of those policies, it'll be incumbent on the city council and city staff to consider whether there should be complementary programs in support of those policy statements. So there are several existing plans and strategies that reference prevention and stabilization programs. So we wanted to make sure we're really taking all of those into account. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Ms. Byers to share with council some of the programs that are already in existence and some of the programs that are being proposed, and then lay out really a framework that we're recommending to the council that staff go and do some analysis on overarching stabilization and prevention programs based on this, these set of plans, and come back to council with some additional recommendations about how we can pursue more than just one program around prevention and stabilization, but make sure that it's within that context where we've looked at the bigger picture.
Thank you, Mr. Clegg. Madam Clerk, for the record, Councilmember Freeman entered at 3:42. Ms. Byers?
Mayor, Council. So one of the things we want to talk about is what is contributing to this pressure that we're having for an increase in homeless, not enough housing. And anyone you talk to will tell you it's a supply issue here in our community. So our population over the past decade has increased almost 50,000 residents. In the last RHNA cycle, which was through 2023, 16,561 units were constructed. And so you already have this increase in population. We have been constructing more and more units recently, but you can see where that's one of the factors. But our vacancy rate is somewhere between 2 to 3%, and it goes up and down around there. But a healthy housing market is really 5 to 7%, 5 to 6%. So when you have such a narrow entry or a narrow opportunity to be locating into a residence with the increased population, lack of housing being constructed, we have a supply issue in our community. The housing element has shown it. Conversations even yesterday at the Housing and Homeless, when we look at the BKRHC homeless strategies, talks about the supply issue. Mr. Clegg was showing you the different examples of types of housing. And so we have 125,143 housing units here in Bakersfield. This home ownership and this rate, so I started in November of 21. At the time, it was 59.7% home ownership across the city. It's currently 58.48, which leaves renters, 41% of our community is renters. Then we start to also look at the age of our existing housing stock. About 50% of our housing is over 40 years old. And really, studies have shown, and even our housing element talks about, that housing that's over 30 years old is most likely to need rehabilitation, whether that's new plumbing, roof repairs, foundation work. And so some of these older houses may have additional health risks, such as lead-based paint, such as asbestos. So really, the housing stock that we're talking about that is most likely to need rehabilitation is that greater than 30 years old, and 50% of our housing stock is at that. The housing element also looked at the number of units in our community that has code enforcement, and about 4% of our housing has active code enforcement activities occurring. And so this is one of the supply issues that we have in our community, that we have aging housing, we have lack of housing, we have a very tight vacancy rate, and we have more people moving to our community. And so that contributes to it. Another contributing factor is the rise in value. You look at the median rental rate, it's increased 62% since 2015. We utilize HUD's data, the CHAZ data, and it's 2015 to 2019. And so if you look at increase of 62% since 2015, the rate back in 2019 was that almost half of the residents who rent in the city are considered cost burden. Community-wide, 36% is considered cost burden. And so we look at this demographics by race, by income, by home ownership. Even homeowners are cost burden, and it looks like about 27% of homeowners are additionally cost burden. And if they're in one of those units that's greater than 30 years old, cost burden, not doing deferred maintenance, then when they move out, you really have a struggle with the units in our neighborhoods. So the California Tenant Protection Act was 2019, and that was the state's attempt to do rent control So you cannot, over a 12-month period, increase the rent greater than 10% or 5% of the consumer index for the region, which our region, it has been about 10% the last couple of years. They also identified what is considered just cause eviction, no fault, and fault. So a fault just cause is somebody who's not paying their rent, and then a no fault is the landlord has requested the individual to move out. But we look again back at what that median rate has increased. It's increased 62%. You can only raise rent 10%. You start to see kind of a struggle with landlords who want to receive more money and who are then evicting tenants. And so we listed this as one of the contributing factors as well. So what do we have going on? We have a lot of existing programs and then programs we're working through. Fair housing, the city currently contracts with GBLA, and I want to be very specific about what that contract is. GBLA is a qualified fair housing organization, which HUD requires us to have because we're an entitlement city. So we are required to have qualified fair housing, but fair housing at the federal level is really defined more towards discrimination. The state has language for what fair housing is, but when we look at fair housing, we are looking at it solely from the lens of the federal government and discrimination based. And so that is the activities that they provide for us now. Tonight, there is going to be an item later for City Council for an eviction prevention program, and staff is recommending GBLA, and we'll have them speak to us in just a minute. We also have a home buyer assistance. We utilize home funds. The city contracts with VCC DC. They are also a HUD certified home ownership specialist, and that's why we contracted with them. They provide home buyer education and down payment assistance. So when we start to look at home ownership, these greater than 30 years old, all of these things, this is what VCC DC does for new homeowners who are interested in going through the program and receiving down payment assistance. We have tenant-based rental assistance. Currently, we have several resources going to that. We have $1 million that was allocated at the mid-year budget from the interest we received from our ARPA funding. Tonight, there's an item for a substantial amendment to our home funds for $1 million to go to CAP-K for tenant-based rental assistance. HAP has 5 cycles, and in those 5 cycles, $1,495,000 is allocated to tenant-based rental assistance. 10% of that is set aside for youth. Another program we have is Home Access. That's a CDBG program that assists homeowners who have ADA challenges. And so we can do ramps, we can do showers for those that are disabled. We've had that program for several years. It's about $50,000 annually. We also have a home repair and weatherization program. From ARPA, we allocated $1 million to that program. It provides up to $15,000 for things like new roof repair, new windows, efficient appliances, those type of things. And then as part of our TCC application, it did include a solar program so that homeowners could get better prices on PG&E. And then the pilot eviction protection program. We have done 2 RFPs now for eviction protection services. The first time we went around, the request didn't line up as far as what the funding we had. And so we went back out and we specified that legal aid would be $275,000 and that we were going to put $75,000 of the funding towards education programs. And so we reallocated it in the second RFP. We had a total of 3 submitters. GBLA submitted for both programs, and then we had 1 each, 1 for education, and we had 1 for legal aid. So this is what we asked to be in our pilot program, to also include reporting. And so this program will be brought back to the Housing and Homeless Committee. We're thinking after 3 months, in order to let council know how that's going. We have a representative here from GBLA, so I'm going to, at this time, introduce Valentin Narvaez. He's going to go over what their proposal was, and then I'll get back up and speak.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome.
Good afternoon. Well, thank you for considering GBLA for this program. As you know, GBLA has been a legal aid organization in the community for quite some time, since at least 1968. Our bread and butter is housing services. We know how to protect tenants, and that's what we strive for. We strive to promote social justice and change through high-quality legal services. So we're well equipped to protect the public, especially our most vulnerable populations. And our goal here would be to try to prevent eviction, as the program indicates. We would service people at different stages of the eviction process, meaning we would try to provide education to those who could be subject to eviction, give them education through workshops. If someone is about to become subject to eviction, we'd want to give them resources, access to those resources. And then if someone is about to be evicted through the actual legal process, we would want to provide representation to that person. And so I think this will provide, will fill in one of the much needed gaps that the city has recognized exists. And so Legal Aid is ready and willing to help our community. I won't go through the slides. I won't read those to you because, I mean, you can read those independently, but I think a better use of our time might be, asking and answering questions. If y'all have any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer any.
We're not able to, at this point. Go ahead.
As we agendized this as a report, along with staff presentations, we can do question and answer. And I would acknowledge with the council that we are not taking action on the pilot program at this time. That will be on the consent agenda on tonight's 5:15 agenda. And so it's okay to have some question and answer, and we're not taking voting action on the pilot program this afternoon.
Councilmember Smith.
Thank you, Mayor. Just from the presentation, it looks like you're already providing these services. Is this something new, or is this something you're already doing and it would just add to it?
So this service is something that we're well equipped to do because we have been doing it. And so this would allow us to actually expand the scope of our services. Right now, GBLA is in a growth mode. And what I mean by that is we're looking to add staff because, as we heard earlier, our population is growing. So it logically follows that the demand for these types of services is also going to grow. So this will actually allow GBLA to grow and meet that demand.
But you are already providing these services?
Yes, sir.
To some extent. Thank you.
Councilmember Arias.
Thank you, Mayor. And I apologize to the public. I have a little bit of a cold, so bear with me. Thank you so much for coming tonight. And for responding to the RFP. We're really excited to get this program lifted off the ground. Just a couple quick questions for you. Throughout my time working in various elected offices, I've referred dozens of cases to GBLA, and really grateful for the work that you've done to represent those clients. Quick question for you. I know capacity is such a challenge across the board for many of our nonprofits. Can you give us a sense of what wait times might look like with your current staffing for any particular case?
Sure. Well, we try not to have extensive wait times. We try to help people as quickly as possible. And the reason that's important is because in an eviction, people typically have 5 court days from the day after they're served to respond, which means that an attorney or the person, the defendant, has to review those documents, understand them, and then somehow figure out the court process on how to do everything timely and accurately. Because if a response is not properly submitted or not timely submitted, that defendant is subject to a default, which means that they essentially lose the case automatically. And it's very difficult to set aside a default. As far as wait times for our services go, we strive to help someone as soon as possible because of that tight deadline. So understanding that 5 court day deadline is critical to the workflow And so over the years, we've improved and, in my opinion, perfected the workflow to help someone as quickly as possible. For example, our call reports, we have VoIP phones which allow us to report on our calls and our wait times. And I personally receive call reports on a daily basis, and I review those reports. And it's always a problem for me if someone has to wait on the phone for more than 5 minutes. So time is of the essence in these matters. So there is no room for delay.
Great. Can you talk to us a little bit about your proposal? You know, $350,000 isn't a ton of money. What does that mean in terms of capacity building? How many folks are you looking to hire on, if any? And then can you talk to us a little bit about timeline? How long can you stretch these dollars for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the money would allow us to hire at least one attorney, one paralegal, and a housing navigator. So we're envisioning 3 staff. When you take into account overhead and things of that nature, I think the money would help cover those salaries. And so we're ready to get started right away. In fact, I have an interview scheduled for tomorrow morning with an attorney that I have in mind for this program. So it's amazing how things are aligning for GBLA, and we're looking to get started as soon as possible.
Great, thank you so much. And then the second part of my question,
Yeah,
in terms of timeline?
Well, I mean, my understanding is that this contract would be for a period of about 5 years, renewed every year. So I don't know if I understand the second part of your question.
To ramp up the contract or to get it rolling?
Yeah, $350,000 isn't a whole lot of money. How long do you think that you'd be able to provide these services through this contract with that allotted amount?
Oh, I mean, we would fulfill the contract term. I don't foresee any problems with that.
If I could help out, Councilmember, Mayor and Council, the $350,000 as written into the contract was intended to be for a 1-year period.
For a 1-year period.
And the as written, there's the option if, this comes back, and again, this is a topic where we've called this a pilot project, and we expect there to be some, council and community interest that will bring back data analysis to the council on the number of clients served. One of the important purposes of this contract is to also gather data to understand what's the full scope of the challenge and issue out there, and be able to report back to council. Are we seeing really long wait lists? Are we seeing a number of clients that we're unable to serve with that amount of support and funding? And that the way it's written on the agenda for tonight is that there could be future renewals based on council future approval, but the funding that has been approved is for 1 year.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. Two last quick questions. Is there anybody in the general population that who might be going through an eviction that GBLA cannot provide services to? Can you speak to that?
Sure. So there's actually a few different categories. So the first would be, and it's important to understand there's restrictions that we have as a law firm. For example, if there is a conflict of interest, the rules of professional responsibility require us not to assist under certain circumstances if there's a conflict of interest that cannot be waived. So that would be the first category where a conflict of interest exists. Another category would be where a person who has income or assets above a certain amount, requests our services. We have restrictions as to income and assets. And then another category would be, persons who may not have status in the United States, an undocumented person. And those restrictions come from the federal government because Greater Bakersfield Legal Assistance receives federal dollars. We're subject to federal law that says, unless there's an exception, we cannot help a person without status in the United States. There are several exceptions to that. I could talk about that for a long period of time, but there are exceptions to it, and we do actually help persons who are undocumented with, domestic violence restraining orders and special immigrant juvenile status, that sort of thing. And so to answer your question, yes, there are people that we cannot assist because of federal law and state ethics rules.
Great, thank you so much. Last question. In terms of caseload, sounds like you're going to bring on 3 additional staff members. Can you just give us a ballpark range of how many cases we can expect to be able to help assist with? Is it going to be 5 a month, or is it going to be closer to like 50?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So the program not only focuses on cases, but it also focuses on workshops. And so we're hoping to have at least a workshop every week where we help no more than 240 persons a year. As far as cases, I mean, if I had to guess, based on the number of cases that we receive and the number of cases that are assigned, I would probably aim for anywhere between 2 to 3 cases a week just for this program. But it's a function of how many people request our services, and that sort of thing.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilmember Barrios. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's good to see you again.
Thank you.
Glad that we're finally getting this up and running.
I know.
It's been a while since we first met in January of 2023, I think it was.
Yep.
Let me ask you a few questions, just kind of winging off of Councilmember Arias.
Okay.
You mentioned your call reports and that you monitor the number of calls and requests. I'm sure you have some tracking data of how many folks have called who were facing eviction that you, for funding reasons, you weren't able to serve. Can you kind of give us a ballpark figure of how many of those requests, if you have that data?
I don't have that, data for it. I can't share that data today, but I could look that up and provide that if you'd like.
Okay. We're interested in this program. 1 attorney, 1 paralegal, 1, was it Homeless Navigator?
Housing Navigator. Yep.
Housing Navigator, right. I had a similar question in terms of the capacity and just wanted to ensure that we can meet that capacity. So I'm looking forward to revisiting this issue in housing and homelessness in 3 months, and then also at mid-year as we take a look at some of these contingency items that we're placing on the budget for mid-year review. In the education work, how do you plan to strategize where those educational workshops take place? Can you kind of give us a better understanding of where that might work, and how are you working in collaboration with some of our other homeless service providers who are also working on homeless prevention?
Sure. The presentations could be held at GBLA's office. We have a multi-purpose room that can hold several people, and it would be great for presentations because we already have the equipment set up there. Alternatively, we can offer presentations remotely, for example, through Zoom. That would be another option. And then third, we could also visit partners and provide community workshops at other offices or other buildings where the public could be invited. So those would be the venues that we could provide those services. As far as other partners go, I mean, we've been working with Flood in the past. We've worked with the county. We have partners in all throughout the community that we regularly work with, and so that would also be a component to provide resources to people that need it to help prevent eviction.
Okay, finally, we asked a question regarding those who GBLA will not be able to serve. I believe we had this conversation a while back in terms of looking at a potential alternative firm that might be able to provide support for those who do not have legal status. But I think that's a very difficult challenge. Can you describe that challenge for us?
Yeah, well, I think the challenge here is that more often than not, evictions are related to money. And so if you have a defendant who is being evicted for non-payment of rent, that person probably doesn't have money to pay an attorney.
Yeah.
And so the private bar is probably not going to, assist that defendant unless they're going to do so on a pro bono basis. So any profit law firm, any private practice is probably not going to make that a top priority. And so legal aid is there to fill in the gap. Unfortunately, because we receive federal funds, there is that restriction that we have to abide by. And so that's why we cannot serve certain types of persons.
Okay.
That's the challenge that we're facing.
Thank you.
Councilmember Core.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation, and it's always encouraging to see our city partner with local community organizations that are already doing the work and have been doing the work for a very long time. I have a lot of love for GBLA. As a young community organizer, we did a lot of work around education, justice within the Kern High School District. So that's where I first found my kind of first steps as a community organizer. So there were great people there who really taught me a lot as well. So thank you for continuing to do this great work. I am also building on questions asked by Councilmember Arias and Vice Mayor Gonzalez in terms of how you, while I understand all the restrictions that are placed in serving those who have sensitive status in terms of their legal status, how do you, I know there are some exceptions, but which organizations are there? Like, can some of this capacity that we can potentially create here, can that be used to also seek out organizations, or do you work closely with an organization similar to CRLA in order to kind of fulfill the needs of our undocumented populations?
Yeah, well, we do often, work with other organizations. CRLA typically doesn't provide eviction services, as my understanding, at the level that GBLA does. They're in other areas of California as well, so they don't service the same jurisdiction that we do. There's not many. I'm struggling to think of an organization in our area that provides this type of service other than GBLA. I think in the time that I was practicing as an attorney, I maybe only saw one case out of the hundreds that I saw where an attorney from the private bar actually defended a tenant. And typically if someone was not represented by GBLA, the person was representing themselves. And so, so to answer your question, we do work with community partners, but there's not really anyone that I know of that does this type of work in our area.
In your years of being in the eviction kind of legal work, are there organizations that exist elsewhere that can be partnered with to bring them into Kern County to also fulfill serving the undocumented population? Like, I'm very curious about how this kind of population gap is met. If we are, like, I'd like us to go, be able to go as far as we can with it.
Yeah, so the restriction that we face would prevent us from co-counseling with someone, who was helping an individual. The most that we could do would be to maybe refer someone over to another entity or another organization. So, unless there's a specific federal exception to representing someone who's undocumented, we couldn't even co-counsel with that organization, unfortunately.
Okay, so the federal restrictions that are placed on you all prevent you from co-counseling
right.
undocumented folks in
Yeah.
court. Okay.
Yeah.
Are you personally aware of organizations that do serve this population that are not restricted by federal funding in the same way that can be a potential partner?
In our area, no. I'm aware of other organizations, for example, in Los Angeles, like the Inner City Law Center, who are not recipients of LSC funds, but they don't serve outside of the Los Angeles area. In our area, I'm not aware of any organization that provides this service.
Okay. I think as this pilot program develops, I would like to see maybe we bring folks in and kind of help meet this gap. And if we don't have it in our area, how do we create that here? Or how do we bring attorneys into Bakersfield or Kern County that can serve that population group to kind of at least spur the service needed for those who are the absolutely most vulnerable. And I'd like to hopefully see something come out of the pilot program that we are creating here, and that being one component of it. So that was just one of the questions I had and one of the thoughts I had. My second question is, within this pilot program, how do you all plan to build capacity to serve multilingual populations that speak Mixteco, Tagalog, Punjabi?
Sure. Yeah, well, I mean, we already serve persons who are of limited English proficiency. For example, by the use of Language Line. It's a real-time, on-demand language interpretation and translation service. So, for example, if someone comes to our office who speaks only Russian, we can pick up the phone, get a translator on the phone right away, and help that person. So that's not a problem for us.
Okay, and in this education program that you're doing here within the workshops, will you also be designing like multilingual workshops as well?
So right now our plan is to do both English and Spanish. I suppose we could look into other languages as well.
Yeah, I'd love to see that as well. I think that'll kind of serve our county and our community in a more full way. And then my last question is just within your own legal experience, can you share how much, whether it's maybe not at GBLA, but on average, how much does a family spend on legal fees? How much is expected on average to be spent when they are fighting an eviction? Just to kind of give a number to it.
How much a family spends?
Or a household, yeah, an individual on average.
Well, I think it's important to understand that a lot of our clients are low income, and so most of them will qualify for a fee waiver, which means that they don't have to pay filing fees to the court. And then if they seek GBLA services, we don't charge them for services. They're free services, and the cost is from our funders. So I don't know that a family actually spends money in defending an eviction.
I meant without GBLA, how much would a family on average, like without this aid, without this program, what would a family who is most vulnerable be looking to spend? And what would that look like without having this resources was really my question.
I mean, it could vary. I mean, attorneys bill at different rates, but I mean, assuming an attorney bills at $300 or $400 an hour, I mean, it could easily balloon into a large bill. And if someone already owes rent, I mean, it's going to be financially traumatic for any family to have to pay a private attorney. I can't imagine what kind of stress that would put a family in. I mean, if a family is already struggling to pay their rent, the idea of having to pay a private attorney would be, I mean, me personally, it would just make me give up. It wouldn't even make me want to litigate, which would mean also that it would discourage me from fully litigating a case to the full potential that it should. It would make me not want to go to trial. It would make me not want to file a motion for summary judgment even if I had merit in that motion. It would make me not want to propound discovery. It would make me just want to file an answer and try to get the case over and done with as quickly as possible, which would only help the landlord. Mm-hmm. So if I had to guess, I mean, there's summary proceedings, and a case can last anywhere from 2 to 3 months if it's litigated properly. I mean, you're talking about $10,000 to $20,000 easily on just attorney's fees. And that's not even counting the debt that the family has to potentially face.
Mm-hmm. That's crippling. Yeah, truly.
In addition to that, not only would a family have to pay their own attorney, but and the potential back rent, if they are not the prevailing party in a case, they could end up having to pay the landlord's attorney as well, which could be another $10,000, $20,000.
Wow.
So the cost is astronomical.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I don't know if someone's already asked, but in the program, in your existing program, how many referrals have you all done for eviction so far? Evictions?
What do you mean by referrals?
How many referrals have you received, or I guess cases have you worked through?
How many cases? I mean, per year we see anywhere between maybe 350 to 500 cases that we actually serve. We receive more requests than that, but like I mentioned, we can't help everyone. But yeah, we easily service 300 to 500 cases a year.
Wow.
Just evictions.
That's an incredible number.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time, and thank you for answering my questions.
Yeah, of course.
Councilmember Gray.
Thank you, Mayor. When the Leadership Council came to my office, we had a great meeting. I enjoyed speaking with all of them. We did come to some conclusions, though, that, excuse me, that there are good landlords and there are bad landlords. And there are good renters and there are bad renters. And we all agreed on that. What I understood coming out of that conversation with them, and that there would be legal counsel provided for those landlords that were good landlords that don't have the financial means to be able to fight those cases where a tenant just won't leave, you know, that they're stuck with them. And I know that, before you answer the question, I know that there are other stakeholders in the community that we've received communication from that are concerned about this program because they're concerned about those good landlords that could be taken advantage of through this, or those good landlords that need counsel and won't have the same opportunity as the tenant. So how would you, your firm, how would you address that issue with landlords?
Well, we wouldn't represent landlords at all. So I just want to make that clear.
Okay.
We would only represent defendant tenants. And so, yeah, I mean, I agree with you. There's good landlords and there's bad landlords as well as good renters and bad ones. But our focus would be to help, you know, the tenants, the defendants who are low income and need that assistance.
So if this program were expanded, City Manager Clegg, can you help us with that? Would only tenants be covered under these city dollars, or would this be expanded to where those landlords that are as great a need that could be losing their property be able to tap into it?
Thank you, Councilmember. And if I may, actually, it's a little bit of a clarifying question, even on my own part, that I would just ask a little more detailed of a question.
Okay.
Is that the distinction between representing clients as well as those that are, you know, receiving just workshop information. Are landlords eligible to receive sort of the workshop information that would be available under this scope of work?
Yeah, that's a good, thank you for clarifying. That's a good question. So, I mean, the workshops would be general information. So, you know, if a landlord wanted to attend the workshop, they'd be more than welcome. The reason it's allowable is because general information is not legal advice. So a workshop can be attended by the public. It doesn't have to be a landlord. It can be just a general member of the community. It can be a community partner. Anyone would be welcome to attend.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, but it still doesn't answer my question.
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember. And I just wanted to clarify that piece, that some of the educational pieces are available to a broader audience. But as far as the legal advice, legal representation, it is as proposed on the agenda tonight is limited to tenant-based legal advice, while the educational piece is available to all.
So, again, would it be a possibility if this program were expanded that it could be expanded to accept legal advice for landlords also?
Yeah.
Because there are landlords that aren't wealthy. There are landlords that maybe this was their parents' property they inherited, and they don't have means themselves, but they haven't given up this home. It's not worth a whole lot, but it's worth a lot to them, and if they lose it, then they lose that income, which could be detrimental to them as a landlord. So that's my question.
Yeah, thanks, Councilmember, Mayor, and Council. That's a policy choice of the Council. I would clarify early in my response that I think, based on the feedback that I'm, hearing and more familiar with as we prepared this agenda item, that it would probably be important to have a different legal entity that could represent landlords, because you wouldn't create a conflict of interest between GBLA and another entity. But as a policy choice, the council could allocate additional funds to the city overall program that could be allocated to that purpose, yes.
Okay. I think the stakeholders that are concerned about this would like to hear that, because it can't just be one-sided, I don't believe, with taxpayer dollars, because we're all taxpayers. And we should all be, we're talking about equality all the time. We need to be thinking about equality in that area too. Thank you.
Councilmember Smith.
Thank you, Mayor. I just had a question, how big your existing staff is?
It's a great question. Well, our staff right now is about 65. Just this year alone, we've hired several individuals, several attorneys, and so we're growing. But 65 is our staff.
And what percentage of your work is this type of eviction protection work?
If I had to estimate, it's probably between 65% to 70%. That's the majority of our work.
So you're focused on all of Kern County?
Yes.
And what percentage is City of Bakersfield?
It's a majority of it. It's probably
Yeah.
70%. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Councilmember Freeman.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, I had read the letter from the Board of Realtors and had several calls from them on their concerns, which I think are very legitimate. I don't, we were interested, we're saying, in the bad landlords, but it seems to me we're not going to be dealing with the big corporate landlords. I think they can handle all of this on their own. It's going to be landlords who have smaller number of units, aren't as sophisticated. At a minimum, I would want to see the workshops, the outreach to landlords and tenants, because if landlords are educated, we may not have so many problems. A lot of this has to come from ignorance of the law. And so they may be a more productive target than the tenants as a preventative measure, because I think a lot of they may have a duplex, or they may have, 4 duplexes or something, but they don't have money for an attorney and they aren't well-versed in the law. So I would hope you could assure us that the outreach for the workshops would be to everyone, because you would really want to see small-time landlords in there learning about the law. And I agree, it's probably would have to be some other organization if we, in the future, create something for the landlords, because I can see conflict of interest. But I do think that, see how it goes the first year, but I really think part of the agenda has to be that we find some sort of legal aid for landlords who don't, have a few units, don't know how to handle this, because they're the ones who get stuck with the squatters. I mean, the lady who sat right next to me for many years here, she had like a couple of duplexes, and so a lot of her retirement income based on it, and she got the squatters. I don't know if she got them out after a year, but once they squat, and you lose all your income, but you have to make the payment on the loan, it can drive you into bankruptcy. There is a problem with bad tenants as much as with bad landlords. So I'd like to see us explore that in the coming months, and definitely before we renew for another year, make that a consideration the council does. Can we get some sort of legal aid for landlords? Maybe there's a threshold. It can't be for people who have 1,000 units. It can't be for the big guys. It's for the smaller landlords. And the other question is, I know you're attorneys, but when people meet with you and have a problem, will you be contacting the landlords before everybody goes? Hopefully they're not already in legal proceeding, because then, but even so, settlement is always better than a court case that takes forever.
I agree.
Do you envision yourself meeting with landlords and tenants and trying to work something out? If the tenant can't pay, there's a certain amount of time they're going to have to go, or maybe you can find rent subsidies, counseling. It just seems to me working together to solve the problem rather than months in court and all the legal fees for the landlord. That's kind of the worst outcome. It would be better if you're more counselors with the court as a last resort. I mean, do you see that happening often, or what's your experience so far?
I mean, ideally, we would love to see settlements happen before someone is placed into the court system, because once an eviction is started, the problem is that a landlord has already invested the money and expense of hiring counsel, and usually, it makes settlement that much more difficult. So, I agree. If we can settle a case before it gets to the eviction stage, I think that benefits everyone. We actually do that. When, for example, if someone receives a termination notice that's a no-fault eviction, typically those are 30 days or 60 days. That gives us some time to actually negotiate a settlement where either there's a soft landing where the defendant agrees or the tenant agrees to leave upon a certain amount of time, thereby saving the landlord money and the defendant a potential judgment on their record. But it also gives us an opportunity to try to work something out where housing can be maintained. So yeah, GBLA actually does that already.
The workshops seem to me to be extremely important
Yeah.
to educate both tenants and landlords.
I
So
agree.
during that beginning 30 days, people have a chance to work something out. But thank
Yeah,
you.
I agree. Yeah.
Thanks.
Councilmember Arias.
Thank you, Mayor. Two quick questions, actually following up on Councilmember Freeman's points. Can you give us a ballpark range of how many of these eviction cases actually end up in litigation?
How many end up in litigation? I wouldn't know that information. I would have to know how many landlords have issued termination notices. I mean, I would guess that if I had to speculate and guess, I would say that a small percentage of them actually go to the eviction stage, and that landlords, there's nothing really to stop a landlord from drafting a piece of paper and placing it on someone's door and saying that if you don't do X, Y, Z, you're going to be evicted. That's a very easy, quick notice to draft up and serve. Whereas the eviction, takes time. You usually have to draft paperwork. You have to get a summons, stamped by the clerk and served. And so there's a very lengthy process that happens with the eviction. If I had to speculate it, the small percentage would go to eviction.
I appreciate that, because I think that there's this, myth out there, I suppose, amongst landlords that, with this program that, GBLA is going to be able to, enter into many lawsuits across our entire city for every single one of these eviction cases. And that's just simply not the case based on what I'm hearing from you.
Well, it's also important to understand that, if you're talking about an affirmative lawsuit, you're talking about a completely different ballgame, because the way the law is crafted, an eviction is essentially known as a summary proceeding, which means it's a civil case that ordinarily would take 2 to 5 years, condensed into a time period of 3 to 5 months at the most. And if a tenant decides to sue a landlord, their case is going to last 2 to 3 years, maybe 5 years, whereas the eviction could last a couple of months. So it really, it's not, you can't do the same volume affirmatively as you could with evictions. I mean, there's eviction mills out there that just crank out hundreds of evictions on a regular basis. But as far as I know, there's no law firm out there that does the same for affirmative litigation against landlords. It just doesn't happen.
And then, changing gears on you, in terms of success, 300 to 500 eviction cases a year throughout the county, how many of them is your team successfully able to win on behalf of the tenant?
Well, I consider a win settlement. I don't consider a win where we obtain judgment. So I would say that every time we settle a case, that's a win for everybody. So if I include that in my definition, I would about 80%.
80%.
Mm-hmm.
Great. My last ask, in bringing this back to the Housing and Homelessness Committee, or even in a year out when you bring back hopefully another presentation with the data to this council, is that we actually track the number of folks that we have to turn away on a monthly basis, and really start to define why it is that we are unable to provide that service, whether that be capacity issues or one of the classes of folks that GBLA is not able to provide services to. That data would be really helpful to me. With the numbers that you gave us, on the upper end, that's about with the $350,000, it's about 150 additional cases a year, and we know that there's much larger number of evictions that take place every single year. So that data would be super helpful as we kind of take our next steps. Thank you.
Understood.
What percentage of the eviction cases that you defend are related to not related to somebody's inability to pay, but rather related to property damage, something illegal that really is more on the fault of the tenant versus just a financial issue?
Well, you know,
Drugs.
the majority of the eviction cases that we see are related to non-payment of rent, about 90%. Other types of cases that we see are no-fault evictions, where there's a just cause reason. For example, the landlord intends to do substantial remodel, or the landlord intends to move into the property. There's some other minor exceptions, maybe a breach of a covenant of the lease. Maybe there's some other violation of law, like a nuisance. I think that relates to your question about property damage. It's a very small percentage. It's under 10%.
Thanks. Vice Mayor.
Just a quick question. So I think Councilmember Friedman actually asked a really good question about, you know, the cost related to each case, and it's spurred a thought. Really, this is a flat fee contract. It's not like you're billing per hour. So there's actually an incentive for you to move towards settlement. Is that right?
Even if it wasn't a flat fee, we would want to settle quickly, because it's in our client's interest and
Sure.
the court's interest as well.
Mm-hmm. To settle it and move on.
Yep.
Find some resolution.
Yes.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thanks.
Councilmember Gray.
Well, I'm just curious because I know there are bad landlords out there. And say you have a tenant that comes to you that has been unfairly treated because the house is full of cockroaches, they won't spray, the windows are broken, their energy's going out the window, literally. So what kind of influence do you have over those types of cases where you've got that bad actor? How do you all settle those types of things? Or they're illegally raising the rent much quicker than what they can do, or it's supposed to do, rather?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as far as the habitability goes, you know, sometimes there's a misconception generally that if the property is uninhabitable, or that there's some habitability issue, that all of a sudden wipes out the rent that's due, or that you know, if the tenant can prove that in court, that they win the case and game over for the landlord. The way it really works is that you know, if you were to raise, as a tenant, if you were to raise a habitability defense in an eviction, the court, if the court agrees that there is a habitability breach on the landlord's part, then the judgment would be a conditional judgment, meaning that the tenant would have about 5 days to pay the difference between the rent that was owed minus the reduction of value from that habitability breach. And if the tenant doesn't pay that in 5 days, then, you know, the judgment goes into the landlord's favor. It's the same concept with an illegal rent increase. If a landlord has illegally increased the rent, it doesn't mean that no money is due to the landlord. It just means that that portion that was illegally raised probably wouldn't be collectible by the landlord. So there probably could still be money owed by the tenant even if the tenant can prove that there was an illegal rent increase.
So all those decisions, then, you all are just giving advice that can be determined by the court, and the court's making the final decision, and you're just representing that tenant in court against, say, that bad actor. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, the judge and the commissioner, judicial officer, makes the ultimate decision if we go to trial. But
Okay.
if we settle, then the parties get to make the decision. So it's better for everybody that way.
Right, okay, thank you.
If I may.
Thank you for your presentation.
I just wanted to follow up on that last point, an important addition that we've been discussing as staff related to habitability, because this program is largely designed to offer these workshops as well as legal advice related to evictions. And so I'm sure habitability will come up naturally, and we know that GBLA does help individuals around habitability. But this program for eviction protection or for eviction prevention is actually not designed to address all of those habitability issues. And so that's one of the reasons that we tried to take a little bit of a step back and look at all of our stabilization programs, because we anticipate that as tenants are more aware of their rights related to habitability, there may be more requests for code inspections, and there may be more requests for landlords to address habitability issues. And we will need to be prepared as a city to contemplate whether we're going to provide resources or programs that also address habitability specifically, because this is more about the legal advice related to evictions. And so with that, we actually have a few more slides that we're going to cover, and that's maybe a good transition point unless there are other questions for GBLA.
And we'll go back to staff. Thank you for GBLA for your presentation. We'll go back to staff, Ms. Byers, and then we'll go to the public for comment.
Thank you. I did want to go back to this slide because this is what was requested in proposals as part of our RFP, that the legal aid meet with tenants to discuss eligibility, act as a liaison between tenants and property managers or landlords, and provide legal aid counsel to tenants. And it was specific for low-income individuals. As far as the education program, we did request that it be based on California Tenants, a guide to residential tenants and landlord rights and responsibilities. And I took out the slide, and now I wish I wouldn't have, because it's very specific in this guideline. What is your right from the day you enter your rental unit, filling out the paperwork? What do you do if you have issues, going through all of that? And so, I just wanted to kind of point that out. So what we've been talking about doing, because as we talk about, what housing looks like across the spectrum, what do the issues look like across the spectrum? Are there other ways to have greater analysis? We have several documents, and there's one thing I hate is when the city does research in a document and does an affordable housing strategy and then puts it on the shelf. We have all of these tools at our disposal. The housing element is one of them. There's a lot of analysis and background and details that are included in that. It is policy driven, like City Manager Clegg mentioned. We have the affordable housing strategy, and then with homeless in their strategic action plan, it is about increasing outflow. And so we have some benchmark city research as well as additional best practice. And so what we're requesting at council at this time is to provide us the opportunity to look at some potential programs. So like Christian mentioned, the substandard housing, I've had conversations with Mr. Burns already about the anticipation that once we do start to educate individuals that if you do have a bug infestation, pay your rent, but go through this other process, and then that wouldn't be something that GBLA is taking care of. It would be something that came back to the city and is going to create an inflow of calls to our code enforcement, to our building department. And so we've been talking through that. We do have best practices to maybe deal with that. So some of these are potential programs that we could look at. Substandard housing, rehabilitation. Could there be funding to work on these houses that we know have habitability issues? Rental registry is one of those, not to go after the good players, but what does our housing stock really look like? Do we have something that we know where there's availability? And this is very much a conversation that's happening in the homeless, is having a registry that kind of we know where there's potential to place people. We have contact information. Frequently, when we talk about bad landlords, we are talking about out-of-town owners. We're not necessarily talking about people who are invested in our community, who aren't easy to reach. The police department for loitering has the ability to contact the building owner. And so similar to that, if we had something in lines with a rental registry that we knew how to get a hold of a property owner if we had a lot of complaints on that. Residential hotel and motel inspection, this has become very popular in the last couple of years. The Planning Commission has seen a couple of items. We've even purchased a motel to renovate into affordable housing units, possibly starting there with an inspection program. The Community Land Trust, we're looking at several types of construction. We're not just looking at multifamily. We are looking at home ownership opportunities, especially when you look at if citywide home ownership is 60%, you look in our prosperity neighborhoods and home ownership is about 20%. And so how can we incentivize that? That's one of the construction types in the Community Land Trust that's being evaluated. We did put, City Council put $1 million towards home weatherization and home rehabilitation. And a lot of that is to keep people in their homes when the roof is gone, when they don't have any heat, when homeowners find themselves in those situations, and they frequently do, they will sometimes leave that housing unit. And so if you're able to age in place in your existing home, that's one of the home weatherization programs. We've also talked about residential facade improvement grants, similar to what was previously touted as neighborhood stabilization program, a program through HUD. Do you start to see neighborhoods reinvest in themselves when you incrementally do that? I think we're seeing in the downtown area the power of facade improvements. That's a potential program that we could look at. Rental assistance, how do we make it possible to expand some of those? Expansion of an eviction protection, an eviction prevention program. You've already been talking about. It's possible we may have those needs now. And then the adoption of strategic land use policies, that's really towards incentivizing growth. We talked that we have a capacity issue, we have a supply issue. Adoption of strategic land use policies could be one of the potential programs that we look at. And then how do we fund these things? We can't constantly go back to the general fund well, especially as we're looking at the budgets tightening and decreased revenues. So we've utilized ARPA substantially, but we have to have any program that we have has to be under contract by December. We have in the past utilized our funding resources, Affordable Housing Trust Fund. We received $5 million. We went and got Local Housing Trust Fund, which was state grants, and leveraged our money that way. We utilized our housing and urban development, the CDBG, the home, HOPWA, ESG. We utilize the heck out of those funds, and so we annually bring you that report. We're getting ready to undergo our 5-year consolidated plan, and that's how we're going to spend the next 5 years of funding. On average, we get about $8 million a year that does get divvied up into different buckets. Philanthropy, how can we be working with our landlords? How can we be working with our local investors to see about possibly incentivizing or having the community reinvest in itself? And with that, did you have anything you would like to add?
In closing, the big takeaway is that we recognize that there's more than one way to address stabilization and prevention, and staff will go and do this homework and identify funding sources as well as partners. I want to highlight that really quickly, that the city should not necessarily be doing all of this type of preventative work. There are other agencies that are in this space, and they should be also implementing programs that are in support of the Homeless Collaborative Action Plan. But there are some areas where it does make sense for the city. So we'll go back and do this homework and come back with additional research and recommendations for council about where it makes the most sense to make our investments around stabilization.
Thank you, Mr. Clegg and Ms. Byers. Thank you. And now, Madam Clerk, would you please call the public speakers who have requested to speak on this item, please?
Mayor Goh, we've received 3 speaker cards regarding this item. The public speakers are Sandra Plasencia, Antonio Reyes, and Wendell Wesley, Jr.
Welcome. Please
Hello,
introduce yourself.
Sandra Plasencia, current policy advocate with Leadership Council. Just wanted to thank the city for starting up this program. I really wanted to focus on some of the dialogue that was focused on today. The big one being why do we not push for representation of landlords, right? And the reason being is because there is a huge gap that hasn't been talked about. John Donegan from the Californian actually said in an article a few weeks ago, 72% of landlords have representation in court when less than 2% of tenants do. That is the gap that we are trying to address when it comes to the eviction prevention program, right? That is what we want to help. We want to make sure that the folks that GBLA cannot help due to capacity because of restrictions are being helped throughout the city, right? And those are the folks that I get calls from on a weekly basis. I know a lot of the council members get calls from these folks also probably on a daily basis, right, as elected officials. So I really wanted to highlight the fact that we are trying to address the gap that we are seeing from residents, right? And as Valentin clearly stated, residents or families, right, will have to endure $10,000 to $20,000 of debt when they go in through evictions. I cannot afford that, right? I would end up on the street, or I would have to move in with my parents. A lot of the families that we work with have to endure that as well. And they shouldn't have to, right? Because if they cannot be represented with the funding allocated by the city, they should not have to endure that. The last thing I wanted to state is I think a lot of the programs that the city is presenting are really great, but I really wanted to focus on the fact that a lot of the programs that are mentioned up there, we have suggested through our housing element comments, right? So we really encourage the city to keep working with us. Because the EPP program, eviction right to counsel, inclusionary zoning, permanent rental assistance, these are all programs that could qualify under the presentation that was just given by staff. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Placencia. Next speaker, please.
Antonio Reyes.
Welcome. Please introduce yourself.
Antonio Reyes. Good afternoon, Mayor Go, Vice Mayor Gonzalez, and all city council members. I'm with the Associated Students Incorporated, or student government at CSU Bakersfield, and it is my pleasure to represent our community of over 9,000 students as the Vice President of Legislative Affairs. I come to you today to express our strong support for the allocation of $2 million to the Eviction Protection Program. At CSUB, we are acutely aware of the challenges faced by our student body concerning housing. This past year alone, 25 students have relied on emergency funding due to precarious living situations, and approximately 10% of our student population experiences housing instability annually. That is over 900 students facing housing instability each year. These numbers represent individuals whose academic success and personal well-being are being compromised by the threat of eviction and homelessness. I draw personal experience with this issue from my 2.5 years as a housing navigator at the Open Door Network. But let me start by saying that I have great respect and admiration for the folks who work every day to change the lives for the most vulnerable in our community at organizations like these. The work there is hard. There were days I had to tell families that they were going to have to sleep in their vehicle, or that they were a few dollars over income and they didn't qualify for services anymore. But some of the toughest stories I heard came from students or student parents who were just trying to better their lives and lift their families up from financial insecurity. We often talk about wanting to see the city rise and seeing our residents rise with it. One of the most effective ways that residents of Bakersfield can rise economically is with a degree, which is why we shouldn't make it difficult for students that are experiencing housing instability to get services. Programs like the EPP are crucial to helping mitigate these situations before they happen. Investing $2 million in the EPP aligns with the city's commitment to improving the quality of life for residents and, by extension, our students at CSUB. I look forward to working with the members of the City Council on how to best serve our students and to seeing the City Council take decisive action to support the Eviction Protection Program and address the ongoing housing crisis in our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reyes. Madam Clerk, would you just hold for a minute? We have a lot of people at the door. Can we have everybody get seated, please, who is in the back? And then officers, if you could just hold the door, have the people stand in the lobby until our last speaker finishes so we don't have an interruption there. Just hold on until people are seated. Those of you who want to put your cards up here, if you just hold off so Mr. Wesley can speak, we'll wrap this up in just a minute. Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Wesley.
Okay, Wendell Wesley Jr. Thank you, Mayor Go, Vice Mayor, City Council, City Management. You know, I was turned down by GBLA twice. The second time it was because our apartment complex gave us a rent increase of $100. That was way over the 10%. They gave that to everyone. So I knew they were full of it. I tried to get help. I was turned away. So I'm not for sure about GBLA. Maybe it was just color of my skin. I don't know. I hate to think that, but I couldn't see a reason why I needed to be turned away. I was a resident there, unless there was an age restriction. So show me a lazy landlord, we're gonna have a problem with that apartment complex or house having a habitability issue. Okay, landlords need to be responsible and tell their tenants what they expect of them when they see a little bit of water coming down from the sink, the toilet, or whatever, okay? So we all need to work together, but the reality is we have a lot of lazy landlords out there. We have a lot of good landlords, but we're not trying to focus on the good landlords. We're focusing on the bad ones. They're not doing our city any favors by being that way. And if the tenant doesn't know what the expectations are, then the place goes to rack and ruin. So we really need this program. We're still gonna ask for this funding because we believe that no one's gonna do it better than we are. Because we are in there with the community and we are aware of the problems in the situation. I don't believe GBLA really is aware of the problems in the situation that faces tenants. And we need a large media campaign so that we can educate the general public, the tenants, and landlords as well. Because, you know, by the time you get to a workshop, it's too late for most of those people. You know, we need to start educating the general public now about what their role is as a tenant in order so that they can stay housed.
Mr.
Okay.
Wesley, thank you. Your time's up. If you can
Thank
bring
you.
her. Thank you. Thank you. And I believe Madam Clerk, was that our last speaker there?
Yes, Mayor Go.
All right, so I'll go back now to council for any further comments. Seeing none, Vice Mayor.
Motion to receive and file.
You have a motion. Please cast your votes.
Motion is unanimously approved.
Thank you. And with that, we stand adjourned at 5:09. We will resume the next meeting at 5:25. No, we don't have a closed, no closed session, but let's take 15 minutes. Sorry to keep all of you waiting, but our last meeting ran quite long. Thank you.